The locals called it Gravewind Mountain, a name whispered with a mixture of reverence and fear, often followed by the sign of the cross. They said the trees themselves held memories, that the wind scouring its jagged peaks carried the last desperate breaths of those who never returned. Stories were told of hikers found weeks later, miles from any trail, with no marks on them save for a look of stark, frozen terror on their faces. For Jason, an avid and somewhat arrogant hiker, these were just ghost stories, campfire tales designed to spook tourists and keep the best trails for the locals. He saw Gravewind as the ultimate solo challenge, a notch on his belt that would earn him serious bragging rights among his peers who settled for well-trodden paths. He set off on a crisp autumn morning, the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The lower trails were beautiful, deceptively serene. Sunlight dappled through a canopy of brilliant orange and gold, and the rhythmic crunch of leaves under his heavy boots was a comforting, meditative sound. But as the day wore on and the incline steepened, the atmosphere began to shift almost imperceptibly at first. The vibrant foliage gave way to gnarled, skeletal trees, their bare, black branches clawing at a sky that had faded to the color of slate. The cheerful chirping of birds ceased, replaced by an unnerving, profound silence that seemed to press in on him, muffling even the sound of his own passage. An unnatural cold, far colder than the autumn air should allow, clung to him, a damp chill that seeped through the layers of his technical gear and settled deep in his bones. Jason ignored the persistent prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the distinct and illogical feeling of being watched. He was a man of logic, of maps and compasses, and his instruments dictated that he was utterly alone. By late afternoon, he found a small, sheltered clearing just below the summit, a perfect spot to make camp. As he hammered in the last tent stake, a thick, greasy fog rolled in with uncanny speed, not drifting but pouring over the ridge like a malevolent waterfall. It blanketed the clearing and swallowed the world beyond a 10-foot radius, isolating him in a damp, gray bubble. The silence deepened, becoming heavy and oppressive, as if the fog itself had weight and substance. He cooked a quick meal, the hiss of his small stove sounding like a scream in the stillness. As dusk bled into an inky, moonless night, Jason zipped himself into his tent, feeling a strange reluctance to leave the world outside. He tried reading by the light of his headlamp, but the words swam before his eyes, his focus shattered by the unnerving quiet. The only sound was his own breathing, loud and ragged in his ears, and the frantic thumping of his heart, a rhythm he couldn't seem to slow. That's when he first heard it. A whisper, faint and dry, like dead leaves skittering across stone. It was right outside his tent, just on the other side of the thin nylon wall, a sound that had no right to exist in the windless void. Sssss. Jason! His blood ran cold. He snapped his headlamp off, plunging the tent into absolute darkness, believing foolishly that if he couldn't see, he couldn't be seen. He held his breath, straining to listen, every nerve ending alight. It had to be the wind, his frantic mind reasoned, the wind playing tricks, shaping itself around his name. But there was no wind. The air was deathly, unnaturally still. Minutes crawled by, each second an eternity. Then a new sound, a soft, deliberate. It was the sound of something heavy and limp being dragged in a slow, inexorable circle around his tent. He fumbled for his high-powered flashlight, his fingers clumsy and numb with a sudden, paralyzing terror. He clicked it on, aiming the bright beam at the tent door. "Who's there?" His voice cracked, a pathetic tremor in the vast, uncaring emptiness. The dragging sound stopped instantly. The silence that followed was somehow worse, pregnant with dreadful anticipation. He slowly unzipped the tent flap, poking his head out into the foggy abyss. The beam of his flashlight cut a brilliant white cone through the gloom, illuminating nothing but damp earth, glistening condensation on the grass, and the ghostly, twisted shapes of nearby trees. There were no tracks, no sign of disturbance in the soft soil around his tent. He retreated back inside, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was just tired, he told himself. His mind was conjuring phantoms from the fog. He zipped the tent shut, took a deep, shuddering breath, and tried to rationalize. But the cold in the tent was now biting, a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. He could see his own breath fogging, thick and white, in the beam of his headlamp. Then a shadow fell over the tent wall, eclipsing the faint ambient light of the fog. It was the silhouette of a man, impossibly tall and gaunt, with limbs that were too long, too thin, stretched at unnatural angles, like a poorly assembled scarecrow. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, a silent, patient sentinel in the fog. Jason scrambled backwards, a strangled gasp escaping his lips as his back hit the far wall of the tent. He watched, paralyzed, as the silhouette of a long, skeletal finger rose and slowly, deliberately, traced a line down the side of his tent. He didn't hear a sound, but he felt it, a low, resonant vibration that hummed through the ground and up his spine, making his teeth ache. The whisper came again, no longer outside, but inside the tent with him, a chorus of disembodied voices hissing directly into his ear from all directions at once. "We've been waiting. So cold. So terribly alone." The head of the silhouette pressed against the tent wall, distorting the thin fabric. It was just inches from his face, the impression of a gaunt, hollow-cheeked face with a gaping, silent, screaming mouth. A wave of icy, primal dread washed over Jason, so potent it was nauseating. This was not a man. It was a memory, an echo of suffering trapped on this cursed mountain, and it was starved for the warmth of the living. Primal fear finally broke his paralysis. He didn't scream. The sound was trapped in his constricted throat. He grabbed his pocket knife, the handle slick in his sweaty palm, and with a guttural sob, he slashed a jagged hole through the back of the tent. He scrambled out into the freezing fog, falling and stumbling over roots and rocks he couldn't see. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. He ran. He ran blindly, recklessly, down the treacherous, invisible trail. The whispers followed him, weaving through the trees, a symphony of sorrow and malice. They called his name in pleading, mournful tones, then twisted into dry, rattling laughter that promised an eternity of cold and darkness. He felt the phantom touch of icy fingers brushing his jacket, heard the snap of twigs just behind him, and ran harder. Jason ran until his lungs burned with fire and his legs gave out, tumbling onto the gravel of the trailhead parking lot, just as the first gray light of dawn broke through the oppressive gloom. He lay there, gasping, covered in mud and bloody scratches, his eyes wide with a terror that would never leave him. He never hiked again. He sold all his gear and moved to a small apartment in the heart of the city, surrounding himself with the constant noise and light of humanity as if it were a shield. But even there, on quiet nights, when the wind rattles his window pane, he can still hear it, a faint, dry whisper, carrying a profound chill that has nothing to do with the weather, reminding him that he is never, ever truly alone. The last rays of the autumn sun bled out behind the jagged peaks of Shadowspire Heights, painting the sky in bruises of purple, orange, and a sickening yellow. The mountains, aptly named, looked like the spine of some colossal sleeping beast, its stony ridges sharp enough to tear the clouds. For Nicole and Christine, the magnificent view was no longer a comfort, but a warning. The trail, a well-trodden, friendly path just hours ago, had vanished, swallowed by a uniform carpet of fallen leaves and deceptive undergrowth. Every twisted tree looked the same. Every shadow deepened into an abyss that promised to swallow them whole. "It should have been right here," Christine said, her voice thin and tight, the sound absorbed by the oppressive silence of the woods. She traced a line on the now useless map with a trembling finger. "The switchback to the western ridge. It's just gone." Nicole, ever the pragmatist, scanned their surroundings, her jaw set so tight it ached. "We must have taken a wrong turn after that landslide area. The terrain's shifted." She tried to keep her tone even, a steady anchor against the rising tide of her friend's panic, a panic she could feel coiling in her own stomach. "We'll backtrack. We've got headlamps, we've got supplies. We just need to be smart about this." But backtracking proved impossible. In the dying light, their own footprints were lost in a sea of rust-colored leaves. Every direction seemed to lead them deeper into the indifferent wilderness, a labyrinth of bark and shadow. An hour of circling brought them past the same uniquely split boulder 3 times, confirming their terrifying predicament. The temperature plummeted and the wind began to speak, whispering through the pines with a sibilant, mournful sound that scraped at their raw nerves. They were well and truly lost. "We have to stop," Nicole finally conceded, her breath pluming in the frigid air like a ghost. "Pushing on in the dark is suicide. We'll find a clearing, build a fire, and wait for sunrise." Christine nodded numbly, her face a pale, ghostly mask in the gloom. She was trying to be brave, but Nicole could see the terror shimmering in her eyes, wide and reflecting the encroaching darkness. They found a small, semi-sheltered area beneath a gnarled oak, whose branches looked like arthritic fingers clawing at the sky. The fire, once it caught, was a small, defiant bubble of warmth and light in an ocean of oppressive black. It cast their shadows long and distorted, making them dance like monstrous puppets on the wall of trees. The night deepened, absolute and suffocating. The familiar sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of a small animal, were distorted, magnified by their fear into something predatory. Every snap of a twig sounded like a deliberate footstep. Every gust of wind sounded like a name being whispered. Christine sat hunched, wrapped in a thermal blanket, her knuckles white as she gripped a cup of lukewarm tea she wasn't drinking. "Did you hear that?" she asked suddenly, her head snapping up. Nicole strained her ears, hearing only the thumping of her own heart. "It's just the wind, Chris." "No!" Christine insisted, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "It wasn't the wind. It sounded like humming." They fell silent, listening with an intensity that was painful. And then Nicole heard it too. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a faint low-frequency vibration in the air that she felt in her teeth. It slowly resolved into a faint, monotonous melodic sound drifting through the trees. It was a lullaby, a simple tune that was so deeply, horribly out of place in this cold, hostile wilderness that it felt like a violation. It grew steadily louder, closer, a thread of sound weaving through the darkness, pulling something dreadful along with it. Nicole grabbed her high-powered flashlight, its beam a sharp, trembling cone against the darkness. She swept it across the tree line, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nothing. Just endless, silent trees, watching them with a silent malevolence. "There's no one there," she said, trying to convince herself as much as Christine. And then the light caught it. A figure emerged from between 2 ancient pines, perhaps 50 yards from their camp. It was an old woman, her form stooped and frail. She wore a tattered, homespun dress of faded gray that seemed to belong to another century. Her hair was a wild white tangle, around a face etched with 1,000 wrinkles. But it wasn't her appearance that made the blood freeze in Nicole's veins and the air feel like ice in her lungs. It was her movement. She wasn't walking. Her feet, clad in worn leather boots, dangled a good foot above the roots and rocks of the forest floor, completely still. The fallen leaves beneath her were undisturbed. She was floating, gliding towards them, with an unnatural, silent smoothness that defied all logic and sanity. Her head was tilted slightly, and the humming came from her unseen lips, a dreadful, serene melody that promised nothing good. Nicole's mind screamed a frantic, desperate denial. This wasn't real. It was a hallucination, a trick of the light, a waking nightmare born of exhaustion and fear. But the image remained steady and undeniable, a fixed point of horror in a spinning world. The old woman floated closer, her path straight, her pace unhurried and inevitable. Beside her, Christine made a sound, a choked, guttural gasp that was half scream, half sob. "What is that? Oh God, Nick, what is that?" Her composure, already fragile, shattered into a million pieces. She scrambled backward, away from the firelight, away from the impossible sight, her hands scrabbling at the dirt. "It's not real! It's not real! It can't be! Christine, calm down! Get a grip!" Nicole hissed, her voice shaking despite her command. But Christine had gone hysterical. She was pointing, her arm rigid with terror. Her feet! Nick, look at her feet! She isn't walking, she's floating. "Oh my God, we're going to die! It's her! It's the woman they whisper about in the town!" Her shrieks tore through the night, wild and ragged, the sounds of a mind breaking under an unbearable weight. The humming stopped abruptly. The floating woman paused, her head slowly, mechanically, lifting. In the beam of Nicole's trembling flashlight, they saw her face clearly for the first time. Her eyes were milky white, blind and depthless, like ancient pearls, and her mouth was a lipless slit that offered no hint of expression. Yet, somehow, Nicole knew the woman was looking right at them, seeing past their skin and into the frantic, terrified beating of their hearts. The sight of that face, combined with her friend's screaming, broke Nicole's paralysis. Adrenaline surged through her, sharp and metallic. She grabbed Christine's arm, trying to pull her to her feet. "We have to run! Now!" But Christine was a dead weight, convulsing with sobs on the cold ground, lost to the terror. And the woman was moving again. She floated towards them, faster now, a silent specter against the blackness of the woods. Her arms, thin as sticks, rose slowly at her sides, palms up as if in welcome. The air grew colder, thick with an ancient predatory malice. The fire flickered and shrank, as if the very warmth of it was being devoured. And Nicole knew with a certainty that went beyond reason that the dawn was not something they would live to see. The locals called it Blood Mist Ridge, a name that tasted of rust and folklore. They spoke of it in hushed tones over lukewarm coffee in the town's only diner, their eyes wide with a generational fear that Trevor, a man who believed only in topo maps and the strength of his own 2 feet, found quaintly amusing. He'd overheard one old-timer warning a tourist, his voice a gravelly whisper about a fog that don't just hide things, it digests them. To Trevor, it was just another jagged line on a map, a challenge to be conquered. He'd hiked tougher trails, weathered worse storms. The stories of a strange, blood-colored fog that swallowed people whole, and the shambling things that lurked within it were just that, stories. Ghost tales for tourists, no different from the legends of Bigfoot or phantom cougars he'd heard in a dozen other mountain towns. He set out alone at dawn, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. The initial ascent was beautiful, a cathedral of ancient pines and dappled sunlight. But as the day wore on, a profound silence began to settle over the forest. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature, but a heavy, listening stillness, as if the entire woods was holding its breath. The birds had stopped singing. The squirrels had vanished. Even the incessant buzz of insects had ceased. The only sound was the crunch of his boots on the pine needle-strewn path and the increasingly labored rhythm of his own breathing. A primal part of his brain, a part he usually silenced with logic, screamed that he was being watched. The sensation was as real as a physical touch, a cold prickling on the back of his neck, the feeling of countless unseen eyes tracking him from the dense, unmoving shadows. He'd stop, scanning the undergrowth, but see nothing but trees, playing tricks on his eyes. It was late afternoon when he saw the first wisps of it, a faint, pinkish vapor clinging to the forest floor, seeping from the damp earth like a spectral hemorrhage. Within minutes, the wisps coalesced into a thick, swirling blanket of crimson fog. It wasn't natural. The color was a deep, visceral red, like blood diluted in water, and it moved with an unnerving intelligence. It didn't drift on the non-existent breeze. It poured through the trees, a silent, liquid tide swallowing the landscape, deliberately sealing the path behind him and pooling thickly on the trail ahead. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at him. His GPS was dead, the screen a blank void. His compass needle spun erratically, a frantic dance of useless metal. He was blind, enveloped in a world of silent, suffocating red. The air grew frigid and carried a faint, coppery tang, the smell of old pennies and fresh blood. The cold wasn't normal. It was a penetrating chill that seeped through his layers of clothing and settled deep in his bones, a cold that felt ancient and predatory. That's when the sound started. A twig snapped just to his left, so close he could have reached out and touched whatever made it. He froze, straining his ears, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Nothing. He took a cautious step, and the sound came again, this time from his right, slightly behind him. It was stalking him, using the mist as its cloak, flanking him with an unnerving, patient intelligence. Then came the whisper. It was a dry, sibilant hiss that seemed to slither directly into his ear, bypassing the air entirely. A sound formed inside his own skull. Trevor. The sound of his own name, distorted and ancient, like dead leaves skittering across pavement, sent a shockwave of ice through his veins. He spun around, brandishing his hiking poles like weapons. "Who's there?" he yelled, his voice sounding small and pathetic in the oppressive silence. The only answer was a low, guttural clicking, like 1,000 insects chittering in unison from deep within a hollow log. It was a wet, sharp sound that vibrated deep in his bones, a sound of pure wrongness. He caught his first glimpse of it then, a flicker of movement in the roiling fog. A shape, impossibly tall and gaunt, was silhouetted against the red. It was humanoid, but grotesquely elongated. Its limbs were like the legs of a spider, thin and jointed at unnatural angles, ending in what looked like sharpened points. It moved with a spasmodic, jerky gait that defied biology, shifting its weight like a puppet on tangled strings. Trevor's rational mind scrambled for an explanation. A deer, a bear, a trick of the light. But he knew. He knew he was looking at something that had no place in this world. He turned and ran. He blundered through the mist-shrouded forest, branches whipping at his face, roots snagging at his feet. The chittering followed, a constant mocking echo that never got closer, never fell behind. It was toying with him. Every few moments, he would risk a glance over his shoulder. Each time the figure was there, standing perfectly still, its head cocked at a broken angle. It wouldn't run, it would just appear. He scrambled over a massive fallen log, looked back, and the space behind him was empty. A wild surge of hope flared in his chest. He turned forward, and his heart seized. It was standing on the path 20 yards ahead, one of its long, spindly arms raised as if in a lazy wave. He could see it more clearly now, and the details fueled his terror into a white-hot inferno. Its face was a smooth, bone-white plate, utterly devoid of features. No eyes, no nose, no hint of a mouth, just a canvas of blank skin. But as he watched, paralyzed, a vertical slit appeared in the center of the plate, parting like a wound. It was a lipless mouth that gaped open into a black, soundless void that seemed to drink the red light from the mist around it. The chittering grew louder, a frantic, hungry static that filled his head. He felt a cold breath on the back of his neck, smelled the decay of 1,000 autumns, a stench of damp earth and rot. He didn't dare look back again. He just ran, fueled by a terror so profound it was a physical force, shoving him forward. The forest itself seemed to conspire against him, the trees twisting into grasping claws, the ground becoming a sucking mire. Without warning, the ground gave way. He tumbled head over heels down a steep embankment, rocks and dirt tearing at his clothes and skin. He landed in a heap at the bottom, his ankles screaming in protest as bone grated on bone. Scrabbling backward, his hands raw, he looked up. The figure stood at the crest of the ridge, its horrifying silhouette stark against the blood-red curtain of mist. It did not descend. It simply stood there, its featureless face turned towards him, its silent maw open. It watched him, a predator that had finished its hunt, content to let its wounded prey crawl away, knowing it had already devoured his sanity. And crawl he did. He clawed his way through the underbrush for what felt like an eternity, dragging his broken ankle behind him, sobbing and whimpering. As dawn finally broke, the red mist receded as quickly as it had come, revealing a pale, indifferent sky. He eventually stumbled onto a deserted logging road, a ghost of a man hollowed out by fear. Trevor never hiked again. He sold his gear, all of it. He moved to the city, surrounding himself with the noise and light of millions, hoping to drown out the memory of the oppressive silence and the crimson fog. But some nights, when the city is quiet and the hum of the refrigerator is the only sound, he can still hear it. A faint, guttural clicking in the back of his mind. And when he closes his eyes, he sees it. A tall, jointed figure standing on a lonely ridge, its head tilted, its mouth a silent, screaming void, waiting patiently in the mist. The stories he knew now were never stories. They were warnings.